Good morning, everybody. Welcome to seminar. My name is J. Drew Lanham, and I happen to be faculty here at Clemson University. I had to clear that up with Dr. Yarrow back there. But it's
now. We don't see him.
yeah, we don't see. Well, we shouldn't be seeing one another in many ways, right? But it does me. I'm happy to be here this morning with you, and it gives me a great deal of pleasure to introduce a champion of bird conservation in North America. This morning, we're going to have the pleasure of Dr. Emily Jo E.J. Williams, who serves as the Vice President of the Southeast region for the American Bird Conservancy, ABC. I like to say sometimes it's the Bird Conservation Agency, really, or NGO, that we hear least about, that in many ways does the most for bird conservation. It's a nonprofit organization with the mission to conserve native birds and their habitats throughout the Americas. With ABC, EJ guides efforts to stop the decline of migratory birds and build constituencies and capacity to enable conservation throughout the full life cycle of migratory birds. EJ focuses her work on bringing partners together to ensure the quantity and quality of habitats needed to recover and sustain migratory bird populations. Her work in sustainable forestry includes serving as the lead for ABC and the Working Forest for Bird Partnership with SFI, Sustainable Forestry Initiative, and over a dozen SFI certified organizations. Ongoing activities include developing, promoting bird-friendly forest management practices, landscape scale conservation through BirdScapes, and research that informs management decisions and data platforms for species of conservation concern, such as one of my favorites, swallowtail kites. EJ's career includes serving as Assistant Regional Director for Migratory Birds and Federal Assistance with the Fish and Wildlife Service in the Southeast and Mountain Prairie regions, Executive Director of the Longleaf Alliance, and Partners in Flight Coordinator for Georgia DNR. In October of 2019, she received the Sustainable Forestry Initiative's Conservation Leadership Award, and in 2017, received NAPC's Gary T. Myers Award for contributions to advance the vision of protecting and restoring populations and habitats of North American birds. EJ is a graduate of the National Conservation Leadership Summit and University of Georgia. She met her husband, John Murphy, appropriately during a bird conservation project while she was working as a forester with Weyerhaeuser. And they now live in Summerville, South Carolina with their 4 dogs, the always fun Norwich Terriers, Max and Izzy, rescued Aussie Shepherd mix Dundee, and Cola, a search and rescue German Shepherd. Without further ado, Dr. Williams.
Is it okay with y'all if I take my mask off to do this? I'm fully vaccinated and I don't go out much. Thank you. I might hyperventilate if I have to do this whole thing. I get a little animated. The only thing I have to correct, because I'm not a doctor, I have a master's degree in wildlife biology from the University of Georgia's Forestry School. And so thanks for letting the dog visit on the cat campus. I do have my 2 little Norwich Terriers with me over at the Martin Inn. They did not know what to do with that giant tiger when you walk in the lobby, if y'all haven't been over there. But it was a lot of fun. I've thoroughly enjoyed my short time here. It's a beautiful campus. So thanks for being here, wherever y'all are that are zooming in. Thanks for joining us remotely. And just thanks for your interest. And so hopefully I will both inform you and entertain you, but it's been some great work that we've been doing with a lot of different forestry interests. And I've been really pleased with both the current work we're doing and where I think it's going to go in the future, because I think there's a lot more to do there. So with that, oops, all right, let's see. All right, help me out. I'm running out of buttons today. Oh, okay. Oh, okay. 2-part process. As Drew mentioned, American Bird Conservancy is a nonprofit organization. We have about 100 staff, and we do work across the Western Hemisphere to conserve native birds and their habitats. We do a lot of different types of work. Part of our staff focuses on halting extinctions of the rarest birds. Most of that work plays out in Latin America and the Caribbean, also in Hawaii, and then we do a good bit of work with seabirds. And so those birds that are just right on the edge of not being here anymore. So that's one of our focus. And then most of the work that I do and the bulk of our staff are concentrated on sort of the middle of our business pyramid on habitats and what we can do to restore, enhance, and protect habitats, particularly to conserve birds of conservation concern. And that plays out in a lot of the different arenas, and I'll be covering some of that today. We do have a team focused on eliminating the major threats to birds. So free-ranging cats, collisions with particularly man-made structures like wind towers, buildings, and there's some fascinating work, especially we have a PhD that works on building design and bird-friendly glass products, and we work with a whole team of architects that tries to get those bird-friendly considerations into buildings. We also work to eliminate bad pesticides that kill birds, and we also spend a lot of time working to hopefully put good policies in place that allow and promote conservation and stop bad policies and promote funding for bird conservation. As you can imagine, we work with thousands of partners across the hemisphere, so we do a lot of work to build capacity and strengthen those partnerships and strengthen our partners. So what I'll be talking about today is what's become our Managed Forest for Birds partnership. This started back in 2014, right when I came on board with ABC, with just, I think we had 4 companies. We had a grant from the Sustainable Forestry Initiative, and 4 of the bigger companies sort of interested in getting together to see what we could do for birds in this managed forest context. As you can see, that has grown and morphed into this partnership that now has, I think, close to 20 partners. And they range from some of the big timber companies and investment companies like Weyerhaeuser and Forest Investment Associates to some of the privately owned forest companies like Large Timberlands over in Mississippi and McShan Lumber in Alabama. So we've got a really broad-based partnership that brings in a lot of perspectives. We've also benefited in this work with some great technical partners, the National Council for Area Stream Improvement and the Avian Research and Conservation Institute, and Klamath Bird Observatory. And you'll hear a little bit more about ARCI when I talk some about the work we're doing with kites. So SFI has a grant program that's aimed at understanding the impact of sustainably managed forests and the certification standards that speak to that sustainability. And so the grants go to understand that connection with climate change and carbon sequestration, biodiversity conservation, and water. And of course, most of our work is focused in that biodiversity arena and at birds, but there's always a lot of co-benefits, and we're still really trying to understand how those things, come together on the landscape. And so what our partnership's been aimed at is first, just better understanding the value of these sustainably managed forests, particularly to birds at risk, birds of conservation concern. But in doing that, we also realized there are a lot of opportunities to enhance those habitat conditions. So sustainably managed forests provide a lot of habitat conditions that support birds, but there's a lot of opportunities to enhance those conditions. And then I'll talk a little bit about how to influence those management decisions and the information and tools we focused on that, again, support developing these habitat conditions that support birds. One of the advantages of working through a network that's created by something like SFI is scale. And there are 360, it's probably more than that goes up every time I talk to the SFI people. But when you're dealing with 360 million acres in the US and Canada that are part of this certified network with the Sustainable Forestry Initiative, it really gives us that opportunity to work with that network and scale up bird conservation, which of course is what we have to do if we're really going to conserve birds and reverse population declines. So the work that we've been doing certainly has the potential to go continental in scale, but what we've done so far is more regional work. And then, we're starting to really look at some work that could go, span the continent. But we've wrapped up our work in the Klamath Mountains of Oregon. We're just starting a cross-border initiative around the Great Lakes in the US and Canada. And we've got an active project in the Central Appalachians. And all that work really grew out of the work that we've been doing in the US South. And that's what I'm going to focus on today. So many of you have probably heard of this, belt of forest in the US South, referred to as the wood basket of the world. Millions of acres of forest in various types of management, but a lot of it is working forests. And, it's easy to think of some of the big corporations that own, hundreds of thousands, if not a million or so acres just in one ownership, like Weyerhaeuser or Resource Management Services or Hancock. But the reality is that the majority of the millions of acres of working forest in the South are actually privately owned by either private individuals or maybe families. And so there's this mix of corporate ownership and non-industrial private land ownership. And so, we've been working with that mixture of ownerships and, of course, management objectives. So we have been doing a lot of work that sort of spans that whole US South region, but for some of our analysis, we did identify these 5 focal areas: New Bern, North Carolina, the Cedar Key area and the Big Bend in Florida. Pensacola is one of our regions that's down in, the Panhandle of Florida and Southern Alabama. Aliceville, which is the area there on the Mississippi-Alabama border, and then Toledo Bend over in Louisiana and Texas. And so I won't talk in depth about all those areas, but I'll reference those a little bit. So we did have these focus areas. So we wrapped up our SFI grant in February, but some of the work's going to be ongoing, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But we were also really fortunate to connect with International Paper Company. And International Paper Company doesn't own any land in the US any longer. They used to. But as you can see, they buy a lot of wood that feeds their mills and goes into the fiber supply chain. How many of y'all got a Amazon or some kind of nice brown box with goodies in it within the last week or two? Well, that may very well have come from an IP mill. They're one of the bigger makers of that. And so, IP really believed in this ability to integrate bird conservation into their procurement operations and their whole value chain. They have a 2030 vision of sustainability, and we feel like birds can serve as a proof point for that commitment to that vision. And they also got pretty turned on, or well, not turned on by, but interested in and saw that they might play a role in the 3 billion birds loss. And how many of y'all read that paper that came out in September 2019 or are familiar with it? So it documented the loss of 3 billion birds. I'll mention that towards the end. But that really got their attention as, so what could we do to try and bring back those birds? So that's another part of it, is to actually contribute to bird conservation. And then again, one of the great things about working with IP, it's easy to go figure out who runs Weyerhaeuser, to be honest, and who works on the ground with these big companies. But when you start talking about thousands of individual landowners, that can be daunting. And so International Paper already has a network of people that work with these private landowners and have trusting relationships with them. So we've really been able to tap into that to provide and sort of infuse bird conservation into that network of private landowners. And then again, it's really interesting. One of the reasons people certify their land and make these commitments to sustainability, you want to think everybody does that just because they're great, and there's some of that, but it's mostly customer driven. So Amazon wants to know that their boxes did not destroy the world. They want to know that, their materials come from a good place, from a forest that's well managed. McDonald's has that same expectation. And certification provides that comfort zone, I think, for people that don't really know much about forestry. But birds can really tell that story of this is a sustainable forest and what it means for wildlife. So we're really exploring how to use the birds as messengers to the customer base that IP deals with. And we do the same with some of the other companies. And so just a little bit more on the IP work. We had to try and figure out how to sort of infuse birds into IP's operations and culture. And so we just started this in 2020. And so we picked 3 of their meal basins, Georgetown, South Carolina, Columbus, Mississippi, and Mansfield, Louisiana, just south of Shreveport. And we've got ambassador birds for each of those meal basins. And I'll talk a little bit more about how we're using that to really, just bring people together around birds and what that means in their forests. So kind of back to that bigger partnership, and IP is part of that partnership as well. Here are some of the things that we really looked at, and that I'll share some data with you on. Bird species abundance and diversity. Contributions at the population level. Again, if we're really going to reverse declines in birds, we've got to be having an influence at the population level. And then again, these tools that can really inform forest management. So what did we learn? We were able to do surveys with our both grant funds and some of the partners directly contributed. We did 3 years of surveys. And of course, there's tons of literature, and there's been a lot of research on birds in the South on managed forests. And so this contributes to that big data set. But we got 107 total species in those 5 areas. And what's real interesting is we found an abundance of birds of conservation concern in a lot of different forest types and conditions. So we were supporting birds that range from swallowtail kites that benefit from that mosaic of forest. They forage over clear cuts, but they've also got to have good wetlands, and they got to have some big trees on the landscape for nesting. Down to Swainson's warblers that need a really dense understory. Kentucky warblers that need a dense understory that's just right and in the right kind of setting in terms of wetlands. Wood thrushes that need a nice mid-story. So this whole range of conditions for thonitaries that need large wetlands with cavities. All the way to bobwhite quail that do well in scrubby habitats, and prairie warblers that need young forests. And so, we found these birds of conservation concern supported on these managed forests. And actually, I think we were a little surprised that some of these birds were found in as great a numbers, just because, these are mainly pine dominated systems and they're being managed for pines, but there's a lot of diversity in there amongst that fairly intensive pine management. And then sort of on the other end, some of the most common birds we found on those surveys. And again, they had that range of habitat conditions from young forest birds like yellow-breasted chats. That was one of the most abundant birds we found. Our kind of running joke, I don't know, how many of y'all are sort of active birders, and you kind of have to, every spring, you got to go pick up your birds. I got to get my wood thrush for this year. And so if you need a yellow-breasted chat, go find some managed pine forest because they are there. We found those everywhere. Indigo bunnies, but also things from mid-rotation like the pine warbler. And then I want to just bring your attention to 2 of the most common birds we found on these managed forests. Carolina wrens up at the top and northern cardinals. Now, where else do you find those 2 birds really commonly? Your backyard, exactly. We've shifted from a rural-based society to mostly an urban society. And so the great majority of people are clueless when it comes to things like rural settings and forest management and, where their box came from. And they're never going to go play around in a clear cut or a managed forest. And I think we can use birds that connect these urban areas to rural areas and forests to tell those stories and bring people together. Because people can relate to the wren that took over their flower pot last spring, or to the cardinal that they see all winter. And so these are great roles that these birds could play in connecting these sort of very different people in very different kind of settings. So one of the things we wanted to look at was bird diversity. And so all of our surveys were embedded in these managed forests. So they were in that, kind of somewhat limited set of habitat conditions. And so to get a feel for what that meant, we compared our survey results to the breeding bird survey routes. How many of y'all are familiar with breeding bird survey routes? So these are volunteer run routes. There's 50 stops every half mile. Those go through every imaginable habitat type, from ag to even, semi-suburban, depending on the route, through forests, through different, settings. And so you'd really expect those BBS routes to have a much higher diversity because they sample more habitats. And actually what we found, and I just used 2 examples, but the results were similar for all of our focal areas. You can see, so the green line, that's the average for our diversity for our surveys on managed forests, and then the black whisker box is for the BBS routes. So you can see for Aliceville, it was kind of right in line with the diversity on that broader landscape. And in Pensacola, it was actually kind of on the high end. And so, that's a favorable outcome in terms of just the diversity of birds on these managed forests. And we could also look at individual birds. And so, again, I was actually a little surprised that wood thrushes, kind of were right in line with that broader landscape on these managed forests. The same for Kentucky warblers. And then again, for some birds like northern bobwhite, and especially for prairie warbler, these managed forests are where these birds are. And one of the points to that is, so think about it, we kind of tend to think of, okay, these forests are being managed mostly for either economic return, forest products, that's the driving factor, and birds just happen to benefit. But for some birds, like prairie warblers, they're actually dependent on that management and that sort of turnover of habitat conditions. So there's a couple of different ways to look at how birds use these forests and why. So we did do some rough, I think, calculations in terms of population levels. And so we had 12 focal species. You saw most of them on that first slide with kites to bobwhites. And so we estimated populations where we had enough data in those focal areas. And so I'll just, as an example, for prairie warblers, we had to come up with a system to crosswalk the company's forest inventory data with bird habitat data. So we did that, and then we pulled in all the forest inventory data. We adjusted it for patch size. Prairie warblers use fairly small patches, so there wasn't much of an adjustment. For some species, there was a pretty decent adjustment in terms of that. And then we used, densities from the literature. And so our estimate for just 2 of those focal areas was somewhere between 45 and 90,000 prairie warblers. And if you look at the Partners in Flight population estimates, that's about 2% of the global population on just 500,000 acres. And so we weren't comfortable just because of the variability of extrapolating that to the entire Southeast. But you can kind of do the back of the envelope math. And if you think of, it's probably anywhere from 5 to 7 million acres of these industrial, intensively managed forests. And so there's a lot of prairie warblers that are finding a home on these intensively managed forests. Another thing that we realized, particularly through our workshops and getting to spend some time with people in the field, was there's literally an army of people that go out every day and make management decisions. They go decide what's going to get cut and how, what's going to get replanted and how, mid-rotation, what's going to get thinned, what's going to get burned or treated with herbicides. And so we had to find a way to get good information in the hands of our forest management army. Now, our forest army now of biologists and foresters looks a little different than the World War I fighting foresters. I encourage y'all to Google that. It's a great story of foresters that actually were in France during World War I and, helping with forest-based needs of the army then. But our army's a little different, but that's okay. And so we wanted to find ways to, take advantage of all those foresters and biologists on the landscape. And so we did kind of 4 main things, and I won't talk at length about field chats, y'all can figure that out, but there's really no substitute for just getting to spend time with people and talk about what are you doing from a management standpoint? Well, here are the birds I'm hearing and how they're using this landscape. So field chats is always good. But we developed a bird-friendly forest guide, and I've got some copies if you're interested. You can take a couple of those with you. This idea of layers of that go into data management systems, and then our workshops. So we started looking for resources, And there are a lot of things out there that are like, okay, we want you to manage for red cockaded woodpeckers or brown-headed nuthatches. Here's what you should do. What we didn't find was you're about to do this management. Here's what you should think about. And if you can incorporate these considerations, here are the birds that benefit. So that's how we wrote this guide. We did pitch it towards both landowners and the foresters working on the landscape. So we started with a thank you because we realized, it's a commitment to own and manage forests, and you have to pay the taxes, and you have to make all kinds of management decisions. A friend of mine in Scriven County, Georgia, Linda Beam, said everybody at some point in their life should own 50 acres of forest land and have to make the decisions that are required to own that land, especially in perpetuity. So anyway, a thank you for people that own and manage forests. Some general recommendations about the overall property. And then we've got a series of recommendations. So you're going to do a final harvest. Here are the things we want you to think about. And here are the birds that will benefit. If you leave your streamside management zones wider, if you leave it messy when you cut, messy clear cuts are one of our big taglines and trying to get people not to clean things up so much. And then we did the same for stand establishment and thinning. And that's been very popular. People are like, oh, I've never seen anything that thought about management this way. So we distributed those to probably about 3,600 foresters across the South. We're thinking about developing that into a phone app, but we're not there yet. That also gave us, it's a pretty general guide, and it gave us the opportunity to do some more specifics. One, for swallowtail kites, the folks at the Avian Research and Conservation Institute have studied kites for 30 plus years, mostly on managed forests. So we had some really specific recommendations that we put into a fact sheet when we're working in areas where swallowtail kites are a target. And then data layers. So, you think about it, especially all these big corporations, they have very sophisticated data platforms that they use to manage the forest. So they've got layers with all the stand inventory data, rare species occurrences, special communities. So you have to be thoughtful before you ask them to put another layer in, because they're already looking at a lot of data, and they're not going to put a layer in for every bird you care about. And so you have to be thoughtful. So we spent some time talking to people about, what makes a good layer. And so you can see some of those things that go into a layer that will get people's attention when they're out making management decisions. And it's really important that you can give them management recommendations. And my next slide will show you sort of what a hit looks like if they receive these. But again, we worked with ARCI to make sure that this was a good layer that led to specific requests for them to consider. So here's an example. I can't actually we incorporated this in the International Paper Company's Forest View data platform to test it, and it's proprietary, so I can't show you a slide of that. But if you look at that, it's covered with green dots of stands that they're buying as part of their fiber procurement. And so what might happen is, here's one of these green dots. They bought this stand, it's ready for harvest. The forester goes out and typically they've either got a pad or their phone with these data layers. And the swallowtail kite data layers, and this is actually the kite data layer, these purple dots, those are swallowtail kite nests. And we actually have two layers, one's actual nest and one's modeled habitat that's ideal for nests. And the forester goes, wow, I've got swallowtail kite nests around this stand. So we're able to tell them the things they should consider given that there's so many swallowtail kite nests in that immediate stands area. And we actually had this play out in real life this year. And I was flabbergasted. Conservation can move pretty slow, even with organizations that are charged with conservation. I was on the phone with International Paper on a Thursday talking about what we were doing with kites and where I thought we had an active kite nest. And Jeremy Boyer with IP said, oh, we just bought a tract of timber there this morning. And I said, really? And he pulled it up. I said, Jeremy, that big pine stand that's fixing to get cut is right where I'm convinced there's a kite nest. And he said, well, what do you want to do? And we pull up the map and I said, well, harvest the pine, but leave that ephemeral stream, leave that hardwood area. And you could even from the aerial photos, you could see these big giant pine trees, which are ideal for kites. And he said, let me see what I can do. The mill really needs some hardwood right now. And I was like, I want to be reasonable, but here's what I do. 3 hours later, he called and said, we're going to do exactly what you want me to do. conservation doesn't move like that. And so anyway, this data really has application. And then just as an example of what something might look at afterwards is the sand's been harvested, but we've left this border of big trees that can provide for kite nesting. So even though it's not right in the middle of kite nest, there's a place for future kites. And kites are very social. So they tend to nest in these loose neighborhoods. They like to be around other kites, and they also like to come back to the same place year after year after year. Another layer that we worked with was further west over in Louisiana and Texas, and we created a data layer to really focus on bottom and hardwood birds. And you can see the birds we used to develop that layer. And that's what it looks like. So, you know, per usual, the red areas are those really important areas. So it's really important if you're going to have management recommendations that are wildlife or bird oriented, they're not going to do those everywhere. You know, they're going to do those where it makes the most sense. So if we can give them a tool that says, if you'll do these bird recommendations, bird management recommendations in the red, the orange areas, you stand the best chance of a population response. So it really gets the most for that investment in conservation. So that's another layer that we've created. We actually did a fact sheet for this one as well on bottomwood hardwood species. One of our big recommendations, are y'all familiar with best management practices? So those are designed for water quality. And they do, there's been tons of research. They do a great job for water quality. They tend to be too narrow for really much bird use. They're just pretty narrow forests. So we're really encouraging leaving these wider streamside forests because it keeps a good hardwood element on the landscape. And if they're wide enough, 150, 200 feet wide, then they can really be beneficial to birds that typically wouldn't find habitats otherwise on those managed landscapes. So another of our tools for getting information, again, you know, personal contact is just invaluable, and spending time outdoors with people in the woods. So we've done a whole series of workshops across the South and had, you know, we try and keep them to about 25 people, maybe 30, just because that's about as many as you can hold their attention. And these have been real successful. I think we've got another 4 or 5 of these scheduled for this coming spring. And that's one thing I was so, 2020, COVID hit our workshop schedule in the head, but 2021, we were able to pull some of those out and just not have any kind of classroom aspects. We did everything outdoors and it worked well. So one of the reasons I feel good about some of the work that we've been doing is it didn't rise and fall with a grant or a series of grants. We found this work, this partnership to be replicable. I mentioned that we're kicking an effort very similar, some of the same partners up in the cross-border region around the Great Lakes. This effort in the Appalachians definitely came from this. And then what was really cool, we wrapped up our SFI grant in February. And that group of partners in that Aliceville area on the Alabama-Mississippi border said, we want to keep doing this. You know, we really think this is a special landscape. And we want to keep working to see what this landscape can mean for birds. And we even want to push ourselves a little bit more. So we formed a Tom Bigby Forest Bird Partnership in that area. The colors are the partners' ownership. So it's Weyerhaeuser, Westervelt, Green Diamond. There's some public land in there. The purple is Noxubee, Sandy Hamilton, Noxubee National Wildlife Refuge. There's actually some tribal lands, and don't pay attention to that line, that's still a work in progress. But the partners own and manage about 20% of that landscape, which is huge. And then we also have the ability to work with a lot of private landowners in sort of all those other spaces and really think about this landscape and what we can do collectively. And we've got research, outreach, forest management objectives for that landscape. And so we're going to be continuing that. That's one of the things that the IP funding has enabled us to do, is to really keep working in that landscape. And then I want to cover our swallowtail kite research in a little bit more detail, just one, because it's way cool. And it's definitely something that sort of come from this work. So I was out as part of our IP work doing some surveys on those wide streamside management zones to see what differences we got and how many more species we got when they were left wide. And a swallowtail kite just flew right over my head. And I was like, oh my goodness, you know, we knew kites were in part of this Georgetown area, but I didn't know we'd actually have one nesting, right here in this area. And so that kind of spun us into action. And I got with Ken Meyer and Gina Kent, who are with the Avian Research and Conservation Institute. They've been working with kites for 30+ years. I think they put transmitters on like 420 kites. So they just have this tremendous knowledge. And so, if you want to catch kites, you want the experts there that really know how to do that. And so we were able to catch 3 kites in the Georgetown Mill Basin and put these GPS transmitters on them. And if you're curious how to catch a swallowtail kite, first you need a nest. That's kind of, they're very territorial around their nest. That's actually a nest, and you can see that little white blob. That's a nestling's little white head up in one of the nests there right outside of Georgetown. So you need a nest, you need a big net, and then you need the arch enemy of the swallowtail kite, which is not Nicole. Nicole is a sweetheart, but that owl she's holding, man, that is something that swallowtail kites cannot tolerate in their nest. They're a major predator of kites. They'll take both adults and young right off the nest. And so you perch that rehab owl. That's a bird that lives at a rehab center in Florida. And he perches, the perch is actually right there, if you can see it. It's right below the ground. And the kites will see that owl and dive bomb that owl and get caught in the net. It is the most amazing thing. We're in blinds to either side of the net. Of course, when the kite gets in there, you run out and then detangle it from the net. But it's really, it's fun. But it's also really, we put the nets up 3 times, an afternoon, a morning, and afternoon, and caught 3 kites, which is kind of unheard of. But it really helped us because it got IP excited, and we're going to expand on that. And so why are we putting transmitters on kites? So one is they tell great stories. When you can send out a message to international paper company staff or to our partners and say, here's what the kites are doing, it really gets people's attention. It gives them that personal connection to these birds and what they're doing. We're also learning a lot about how they use this landscape just north of Georgetown. Both how they use it for nesting, roost, how they interact, and of course we've got a whole bunch of these maps that really show some of their pre-migration movements. Like one went up into North Carolina for a couple of days and then headed south, and then of course we're able to track them. They actually, and this speaks well to the health of the landscape they came from. Typically, a lot of the birds that nest in South Carolina, Georgia, and even northern Florida will move down into Florida and spend a couple of weeks in South Florida. They have these big communal roosts, they forage, get fattened up for migration. The birds from Georgetown, they just blasted through Florida in like a day and took off the southern tip of Florida, and they fly straight across the Gulf and then down typically into the Yucatan, and then they keep moving down until they get to their rearing grounds, for the most part in Brazil, a little bit over in Bolivia. So it gives us the ability to track those birds. And we're actually even able to open up some conversations with foresters in Brazil now about wintering grounds conservation, which is very exciting because Brazil is scary in terms of how it's changing. So that's a new avenue we're just starting to pursue. And then of course in the spring, those birds will come back, we hope, but they're all adults and they have a pretty good survival rate. And then really understand, kind of the full nesting season. We caught these birds in June, which is kind of towards the end of the nesting season. And now we'll get to when they come back in March, we'll actually be able to study that and learn more. And then again, because it went so well, we're actually going to catch birds in Georgia, that Pensacola area, and over around Bogalusa, Louisiana over the next couple of years. And really think about some range-wide questions and what we can learn from more kites with these transmitters. So bottom line messages. Birds work, I admit to being biased, but by the same token, I know it both in my heart and in my brain because what I see in the data. They are good proof points for sustainability. We can study them and we can, understand how they respond to management. They do work great as a focus for biodiversity conservation. People can relate to birds and see birds. I love salamanders, I love snakes and mammals, but you can spend a lot of time in the woods and never see a salamander or a snake. Birds are there and they're reliable. And so they've been really great as vehicles for us to engage this forest community. And again, I don't want to overstate it, but they are great ambassadors. And when it's all said and done, it's about the stories we tell. and they were able to tell great stories. Some of the things that came from our data analysis, these managed forests do provide value in terms of both diversity and abundance. We know that that value can be increased with purposeful and informed decisions. And then think about that forested landscape. You know, there's always something going on out there. And so it's a very much a shifting set of conditions, but the underlying landscape is mostly stable and resilient. So a particular stand may change from year to year, but for the most part, birds should be able to find a similar stand within a reasonable, distance. And so, the economic drivers that keep some of these landscapes forested is something we have to really think about. And so, sort of, I guess our wrap up statement is just this: it's awesome to actually get to work in the U.S. South, because these forests do provide for economics and for communities. They do provide forest products and return on investments. And then they also sustain common birds and can help with recovering species in decline. So it's not often that you can get that many things out of this one sort of resource. And then why is this important? I think a few of y'all said you read were familiar with the 3 billion birds gone. I don't know if I can get the fancy stuff to do yet. Let's see. So there was a paper published in Science in 2019, September, that documented the actual loss of 3 billion birds from the North American avifauna between 1970 and 2018. And I can't actually watch that visual with the snowy owl. It makes me cry. It's just so, intense that those birds were literally lost. And so those losses were essentially in every major biome. The only place we saw increases was in wetlands, which to some extent is the good news story. Where have we concentrated decades of conservation? It's in wetlands, both for wetlands' sake and particularly for waterfowl. And so we know that conservation works, but it takes a sustained effort and sustained investment. As you can see, there were declines in essentially every type of habitat and large scale biome. Grassland birds, the biggest losers, but forest birds were right up there. And so I feel, and I think our work demonstrates, that these sustainable forests are at least part of the solution to bringing those 3 billion birds back. They're not the whole thing, but they're part of the solution, especially again, if you think about those 360 or so million acres of sustainably managed forests in the US and Canada. And then indulge me on a Friday. I would also offer, and I can't give you any data for this, but I believe if you save birds, you save the world, because I think birds are key to saving nature, because I think, most people will not take action unless they've experienced something. And everybody can have a bluebird and know their bluebird family. Everybody can put up a hummingbird feeder and have a personal migratory bird that visits them for several months. And so I think birds provide that personal connection to nature and conservation. And hopefully, since I'm in kind of the right place, if we don't save nature, we're pretty hosed. And, if you look at what's going on in the world these days, we got to save nature and we got to save the world. And so I think birds are a key part of that bigger philosophical vision. So with that, I thank y'all very much for having me at Clemson. And, thanks to our many partners and the cool people we get to work with.
EJ, you have time for some questions? Sure.
Questions. So you showed us lots of data demonstrating the value of these managed forests.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think on one of your last slides, you said there's maybe your opportunities to do even more. So I guess I'm curious, like, which species would you say face the biggest challenges in these forests, and where are opportunities to, to do more?
Absolutely. Well, it kind of depends on the management decisions. So one of the big opportunities is for cavity nesters. So red-headed woodpeckers are a good example of a watch list species, a species in decline. And if you don't leave snags, then you won't have red-headed woodpeckers. And I don't have a data set for this, but what you see if you're out on the landscape is if you do leave snags, you have red-headed woodpeckers. And so there's just an example of one of those enhancements. And snags are considered something necessary in the certification process, but how that plays out can look really different. And so trying to get people not just to think, how to kind of check a box of I left snags, but to be thoughtful about, what they leave out there. Another enhancement, again, is this idea of messy clear cuts. I don't know if it's our European upbringing or some of our roots, but golly, we try and clean everything up. I mean, well, you can look around here, everything's mowed and it's all tidy. And when people try and make these forests all tidy, and to some extent, that's the expectation. Landowners, when they go to check on, a timber cut that's happened, they're like, oh, it's a mess. We got to teach people to go, it's a mess, not it's a mess. And because that's what birds need. That's where the diversity and structure comes in, plant communities that bring in insect communities. So that's a big opportunity, is to leave it messy, leave stuff out there, all different sizes, leave some big brush piles, things nest in brush piles, small mammals live in brush piles, and then hawks can eat them. So that's another opportunity. One of the bigger ones, and this is one of my big pushes, is these are pine dominated landscapes. The idea is grow pine trees and turn those into either returns or products. So hardwoods can really get limited, and kind of marginalized. So where are the opportunities to leave hardwoods? And retention is actually a big push now in that certification process. So we can help with what that should look like and what's meaningful retention look like. And I really do. One of the biggest opportunities are these streamside zones, because they're paying attention to that. And there's a lot of opportunity to leave those wider, and it just creates a whole new habitat. And what you'll see is the narrow stream zones that maybe are 30 or 40 feet wide will have maybe 5 bird species nested in there. And that, I'm not even speaking to successful, just presence absence. You go right down the road to one that's been left, even if it's 80, 90, 100 feet wide, we reliably pick up 24 or 25 bird species. And it's usually the same ones, but you won't get Acadian flycatchers, red-eyed vireos, yellow-billed cuckoos in the narrows, but you get them in those wider ones. So that's a huge opportunity, is to leave those, elements out there. And, I talk to people about, the longevity of decisions. So, decisions around planting densities and the spacing of rows, and those are pretty short-term decisions. The next 20 years, that'll all turn over. But what you do to a streamside management zone, and whether you leave it or whether you cut it, that's maybe an 80 or 100-year decision, or it really could be a forever decision, because sometimes once you lose those, and we're seeing this in some of the places, Weyerhaeuser's got a big initiative right now to go back to places where the hardwoods were cut and restore them, and take some pine trees out and put some hardwoods in. Well, that's a lot more labor intensive and expensive than leaving them in the first place. So, those are just long-term decisions.
We're sitting on, 18,000 acres of school forest?
Mm-hmm.
How would a university forest become a partner in this? And are there any examples of that kind of partnership?
We haven't had a university forest as a partner. I think that would be great. We've had some public lands involvement, and I would guess that university forests are probably somewhere in between. They're don't have the same objectives and constraints and opportunities of public lands. But our partnership is sort of who's at the table. You don't sign anything, you just show up and get interested. So, that I'd love to look at something like that. And in terms of certification, there actually are some university properties and a good many state forests are SFI certified. So there's a whole set of standards that you have to adhere to be certified. And again, the expectation by customers is that forests should be certified. So IP, for instance, has a commitment to source 100% of their fiber from certified forests by 2030. So, but yeah, I think it'd be great. And what I need to check on is in the Appalachians, because there's some different partners in the Appalachians, and I can't remember if Virginia Tech may be part of that partnership. I need to check on that with Todd. Good question. Yes, sir.
In the figure you showed that's describing the diversity differences in certified versus breeding bird site locations, were the forest types within those two categories comparable, or the breeding bird sites drastically different than managed pine stands that were SFI certified?
I can't answer that because we don't have habitat data from the BBS routes. It's probably going to be some of both, because some of the BBS routes, especially in some of these areas, undoubtedly go through managed forests. Just, you can look at where they are, but they probably also go through some forests that are very different. One of the interesting things too is on those privately owned forests, the ones that families and individual private owners, they may or may not decide to invest in certification. It's pretty expensive, and there's audits and everything. Sometimes the companies that buy wood from those non-industrial owners will enroll them in a certification process. So just because something's not certified doesn't mean it's not sustainable. Most private landowners take a lighter touch with their forest management than the industrial forest managers, the commercial operations. Not everybody, but so I would guess if we went back and tried to look at that, I don't think it would be drastically different. But I do think the big differences in the BBS routes are in those other habitats that aren't forested, and there's a lot of that. Old fields, ag, a lot of different things.
That's one of the, excuse me, with BBS routes, if you're familiar, there's never any habitat data taken on those routes. And so we have ideas on trends for birds across a route, but not even tracking changes in habitat, whether a forest goes to an old field or whatever. So
yeah,
it's a pretty critical miss for that data set.
Seems like it.
it is. Well, those routes have been run for whatever it is now.
Since 66.
Yeah. And so everything for the most part is going to change naturally, succession, and then land use changes. So, and if you run a BBS route for a number of years, you'll see those changes, and some of them are heartbreaking. It's like, oh, that used to be such a good place, and now it's, housing development. But so yeah, it's still a valuable data set, but boy, it'd be more valuable if we had habitat data to go with it.
Just a quick question on that data set. How accessible did you say that was? Is that completely proprietary?
Let me think about that. I would say not completely proprietary, because what we did, the National Council for Air and Stream Improvement, they're sort of the data handlers. And so like when we got the data to analyze it, it didn't have ownership with it. So we don't know the Weyerhaeuser data versus the Hancock data. And so probably from our standpoint, I could put you in touch with David Wingfield, who's the scientist that did the real analysis. But yeah, I'd check in with my partners, but I don't think they would mind the raw data just because it doesn't have that ownership information.
All right, because you can always put it on top of it later. This seems like a really cool tool.
Yeah, it's been really interesting. And it was a lot of work to cross-reference forest inventory data with bird habitat conditions, so that they had to write algorithms in each company because they all have a different database. So we had to find a way to pull that data out and make it relevant to birds, and also make it comparable across the different companies. But we were able to do that. So I would think we could probably work with you on some, especially if you had some specific questions you wanted to look into.
Well, I mostly work up in the mountains. My next question was going to be if you're planning to expand up that way.
Which mountains?
Southern Appalachians, like North Carolina and around.
Appalachian Mountain Joint Venture Partnership. Are y'all familiar with joint ventures? So we have regional bird habitat partnerships all across the country. And the Appalachian Mountains Joint Venture would be the one that would cover the southern Appalachians. They cover all the Appalachians. And we don't have a particular project teed up right now for North Carolina, but they do some work with, especially some of the, rare bird species,
Yeah.
ceruleans and golden wings, and,
Yeah.
throughout the range. So there's probably some opportunities there, even if it's not directly through this managed forest partnership. Yeah, the Appalachians is actually originally, hopefully somewhere in all y'all's marvelous teachings, people are teaching y'all to listen. And I know I haven't done that today, I just talked. But when we originally sat down with the foresters with our SFI grant, we went into the room as, and again, I inherited this, but I knew the forest players because they've been around for a long time. And we went in, and our idea was we're American Bird Conservancy, and we were doing a lot with golden wing warblers. And so we went into this room of foresters and said, hey, we want to work with y'all to save golden wing warblers. And they pretty quickly said, we don't really have property where you want to work with golden wing warblers. So we had to completely do our grant, and fortunately SFI allowed for that, to work where we cared about the priority birds and they had land ownership that made sense. So it's taken us a while to get back to kind of ownership in the Appalachians. Weyerhaeuser has a pretty good bit, but it mainly picks up once you get up into like West Virginia. And so I'd have to look at what North Carolina's got in terms of that from an SFI standpoint. But again, we do work with a lot of national forests in North Carolina through the joint venture. And I can connect it. Yeah. And y'all, if you pick up one of these booklets, well, I don't know, I've got some cards. And so feel free to reach out to me, and I'm happy to connect you with the Appalachian Mountain Joint Venture folks.
Great,
They do good work.
And the folks online can unmute or something in the chat box. We have it open. If they have a question.
I have a question. So your goal of increasing diversity in bird species and saving the world ultimately, it's going to take us all, right? But consistently, forestry and the people that we serve, the landowners we serve, are very white. So what are you all doing to diversify and push inclusion initiatives when you're putting on programs in bird conservation?
Right. Well, organizationally, ABC just hired about 6 or so months ago our first chief diversity officer. She's a wonderful woman named Namal Da Silva. And the purpose for that was twofold. One is to diversify ABC, and then two, to help ABC be part of inclusion and diversity efforts, both within birding and within, bird conservation. So organizationally, we're really elevating that as something we pay attention to. Drew and I were just talking this morning about some workshops that he's going to be doing with, Black landowners. And so we're trying to make those connections as well. We were real excited in that Tom Bigby partnership when we learned that the Philadelphia Band of the Choctaws have land, and they're real interested there. And I'm real excited. I just connected with their chief forester and biologist, and they're looking at culturally significant birds, which is just marvelous to bring that aspect of it into what prioritizes bird conservation. So that's a few of the things we're doing, but man, we need to do more. I know one of the things I want to talk to Drew about is land use changes as swallowtail kites migrate kind of down the Savannah River corridor. There's concerns with land use changes, and most of it's traditionally Black landowners, and those lands getting bought up by, I think is it Lay's for potato production. And that would completely change the value of those lands to things like swallowtail kites. So trying to look at, how do we make better connections? And one of the things I know through just some of the IP connections, what's the group? I can't think, we were just
Center for Heirs
talking. Yeah, the
Property.
Center for Heirs Property. So how do we do those kind of partnerships? Because that's what we've got to do. A lot of our work is international. So it definitely includes, local people and communities and indigenous communities. But I think we've got a lot more work to do there. I just have a woman that I work with. She's going to be moving from Texas to New Mexico, and she's a Native American. And so having her on staff to elevate that as something we think about is tremendous. And we have an innovation grant program within ABC, and she and one of our other folks have an innovation grant to better understand our connections to indigenous peoples and how to take advantage of all that indigenous knowledge and really build that into our bird conservation, especially in the West with those, with grasslands and stuff. That's got to be part of it.
The representations of kites in some of the pottery that's found in the mounds. So I'm thinking about those mounds and those effigy mounds, and that those people were seeing some of the same birds. It's pretty incredible. So it's some powerful connections that are coming together. ABC is a great part of that.
Yeah, well, we're trying. We're still a pretty pale bunch, but we're doing better. We're really trying. But it's definitely challenging. You have to bring that into every aspect of what you do. From your work with partners to how you hire people, and it's very challenging to figure out what those new mechanisms for doing your work are that make it more inclusive and just. So, yeah. I do see. I've been doing this a long time, and there's been progress. I know it's not enough, and it still looks pretty bland, but trust me, there's a lot of progress. I was the only female biologist in Georgia for like 3 years. Oh, so we're getting there, but we got a lot to go. But I think it's a good question. I appreciate that.
Any more questions, comments? Anybody online? Let's give EJ a hand.
Well, because I have a lot of them. Y'all can have them. And I'll get some business cards out. Y'all feel free to reach out to me anytime.
And we have, I think, lunch, so, Jess has arranged pizza, right?
Yeah, and it's gonna be a here since it's kind of chilly outside, so I'll go get that.
We're just gonna stay in here. We've been doing lunch outside afterwards, but it's too cold to do for everyone. So,
Right, y'all may get old.
So,
Thanks
feel free
again,
to
y'all,
join.
for coming. Okay, so okay, if I end meeting for all?
Good.